actor performing this Islamic ritual, and it made me feel completely American. And the first time that I had ever reconciled my Arab Muslim identity with my American identity was through Malcolm X. Another person who that would occur through is Muhammad Ali, the late great Muhammad Ali. So there's something distinctly, it has left an impression upon me that's indelible and has remained with me for the last 20, 25 years.
And what is that ritual?
Please.
What is that ritual, by the way?
Well, it's just worship.
Okay.
You know, it's just the canonical worships. Muslims worship 5 times a day. It's a highly detailed ritual that's done both collectively or on an individual basis. And I had never seen an American do that. And it depicted in an American film with an American actor and one who's portraying an American icon in Malcolm X. I also grew up listening to hip hop, and I know of the influence of some of my favorite hip hop artists like Ice Cube and others, which people today may not be as familiar with these early sort of golden era hip hop artists. But Islam played such a prominent role, and it became through Malcolm X. A couple of the other things that I wanted to mention very quickly. Did you ask yourself why he was making these choices? We had said before the film had started, ask yourself, what is he reconciling in his mind when he goes from prison to becoming a Muslim? When he goes from becoming a Muslim with the nation to striking out on his own? What do you think some of the things he was reconciling in his own mind? So I'll open it up to you guys. Why don't we open up the floor? First of all, what do you guys think of the film, for those of you who have never seen it?
Good. Very good. Yeah. It's interesting.
Okay. Especially what?
Well, I was wondering, how is the Nation of Islam, how is that doing now? Is it a thriving religion, or did it fall apart?
Oh, wow, man. Okay, well, the nation's influence has diminished greatly, but we are in the headquarters of the nation in Chicago. Okay, and I live on the south side, so it's still very common to see members of the nation walking around the streets of Hyde Park. I speak with them often. There is a camaraderie between members of the nation and what we refer to as the larger Muslim community, if you will. Sometimes the word Orthodox Muslims is used, which I don't care for. I don't care for that term. There really is no orthodoxy in Islam. However, its status has diminished greatly, and I think this is another thing that the film highlights for me. Times have changed so significantly. When I look at somebody like Malcolm X, I'm looking at a pure activist. Somebody whose activism he was willing to lay his life on the line for. I don't think there's activists like that anymore. They'll tweet, they'll Facebook post, they love being in the media and sort of saying, look, I'm protesting. And sure, protesting is an important American tradition. I just don't, there's something about the context of today, capitalism, social media, consumerism, all of these things have contributed to the consumption of activism. Whereas I think when I'm looking at this perhaps idealized movement, perhaps, there's something more raw and real about the activism of the 1960s and the 1970s.
Well, also to go back to your point, I mean, the things that he is going through and his struggling with, like his identity, are really very large, substantive issues, questions. And today these issues are much more fragmented. So I think it's very unique that somebody to really very seriously take on this kind of large issue, like what is being black.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's so much in the public discourse.
Well, I mean, think about Colin Kaepernick, for example. Okay, I mean, you guys are familiar with the Colin Kaepernick controversy. Colin Kaepernick is an African-American football player who last year decided he was not going to stand for the national... I'm gonna get totally real with you guys. I didn't stand for the national anthem for 10 years. So I feel like I have a perspective on that particular issue. I do now. I totally defend Colin Kaepernick's right to express himself that way. I don't know if it's helpful. I had a personal experience that changed my mind. I was born in Baghdad, Iraq in 1978, and after the first Gulf War, I being a young kind of revolutionary spirit, said, I'm not standing for an imperial flag. I'm not doing that. And some of it actually stemmed from my religiosity. Because in Islam, you're loyal to God. But that doesn't mean you're loyal to God in the same way that you're loyal to a cult figure. It means you're loyal to a set of principles. And no principle can be overridden due to fear. So for example, when I hear people excuse their behavior during the Holocaust, which we know of through the Eichmann trials, I was just doing my job, right? I was just doing my job. That would be something that could never be said from a truly practicing Muslim, or for that matter, I think a truly practicing Jewish person or Christian person or Buddhist person. But the spiritual principle that to be loyal to God means you're loyal to goodness. And nothing can undermine that loyalty. So for a long time, I took that principle to heart, and I took it literally, and I said, I'm not standing, and it may make some of you uncomfortable, but it's the truth. For a long time, I didn't stand for the flag. And sometimes I caught some flack for it. And one day I took my daughter to a football game. She was probably 6 years old at the time, and the national anthem came on. I said, damn, I gotta stand for this flag. Because it occurred to me, I didn't want to pass on my struggles, my political battles, my political views onto my 6-year-old child. I didn't want her in that situation. So I stood. And I had reconciled with myself the idea you can stand for the flag and still oppose things and all that stuff. The display for me at my youth was one of empowerment, but as I got older and I had a child and I had some other thing to look forward to in the future, it just struck me as more self-aggrandizing. I was patting myself on the back for not standing for the flag. So getting back to Kaepernick, and I'm sure I know it's getting late, I don't bore you with that. But getting back to Kaepernick, I have this unique experience in which I can understand what he's doing, why he's doing it. At the same time, from my experience, I don't know how useful it is. I don't know how effective it really is. He certainly started a conversation, for sure. He certainly drew attention to an issue that needs attention drawn to it, for sure. But getting back to what Milos was saying, we live in a time now where millionaires take on these sort of performative acts and performative gestures, and it's kind of hard to reconcile a guy who's a multimillionaire and he's playing football and he doesn't want to stand for the flag. The NFL's highly corporatized. You know, you got NFL owners who say, you know, we have rights too. These are our team. I mean, it's a different time. Whereas when we look back in these times, things were a little bit more clear. They were more clear. Yes, please.
I think the question somebody asked about where the nation is now. I should say that I own the house that Elijah Muhammad lived in.
Okay.
And I raised my children next door.
What neighborhood's that in?
It's in Kenwood.
Okay, got you. So
4847 South Woodlawn, which is in his autobiography several times. That's the address of the house. And Farrakhan's children babysat with my children.
Okay.
But I think, and I raised that in particular because I think that the power of Malcolm X was when he transcended race. And when he went to Mecca and he says, we're all brothers and we are of different ethnicities and different languages and different this. And I think that the reason, in my opinion, that the nation has not grown is because Louis Farrakhan took it back to the white man as the devil, which is a huge regression in terms of world peace and progress. And so I think that's the problem, that the leadership got into a trap that turned people off, including people who wanted to support. You know, to me, Islam is the most beautiful religion in the world. I mean, it's just beautiful. I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam, but I love the Nation of, not the nation, I love Orthodox, I guess to use the word.
For lack of a better word.
Orthodox, because I don't think religion should be political. I think religion should be a way of being in tune with the goodness in the universe and that sort of thing. And I think that that's another problem with it. It became too political. But so I wanted to say that, but I also wanted to say one thing to answer your question about the choices that Malcolm X made in the movie. I was really comfortable with all the choices he made, and I understood where they came from, except the last choice, which was the choice to die. Because he was saying that he knew he was going to die, but he went out anyhow, and he wanted his children there. I'm really having a struggle with that.
I do think a bit of that has to do with the fatalism of purity. That if you truly believe... I read the autobiography of Che Guevara by John Lee Anderson. It's an 800-page tome. And I can recall somewhere early on when Che Guevara had first arrived on the Cuban island with Fidel Castro, and Fidel Castro pulls off this incredibly bold attempt to invade Cuba with 60-some guys or something. Che Guevara was dodging bullets, and he leaves some ammunition behind to save his life. And he thought to himself, and I believe he wrote in his diary, he said, "I will never do that again, because for the cause I have to die." These are contemporaries, Che Guevara and Malcolm X. There's something about that time period in which the religious sentiment of martyrdom is translated into political activism for freedom, equality, and things like that. So it's sort of the modern translation and expression, I think, of the ancient impulse of martyrdom. And we know that both in Christianity and Islam, the concept of martyrdom is profound. That's how you truly transcend the flesh, right? If you're willing to die for what you believe in. Going back to that principle that you're loyal to higher truths. But I think that's a very important point. It is a bit almost cruel when you watch it, that his family was there and his children were there. But I think that's where it comes from. Yes, sir.
Well, let me be real now.
Yeah, please.
I watched Malcolm X in the 1960s. I'm a little bit older than you.
Yeah.
I don't think you were around then in the
No,
60s.
I was not.
He was a racist. He'd go on a cup show and he'd talk all this racist. He scared the hell out of me. I had chills in my spine.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is, I can see how there's all these shootings in Chicago right now. How could, do you actually really believe that he should be a role model for young blacks? I don't.
Let's address that in several parts, right? Let's address that in several parts. There's an evolution in Malcolm X. There's a progression. I mean, it's clear,
He's
right?
a con man.
I tend to...
He's a hustler.
I tend to refrain from trying to judge and assess the consciousness and intention of a man. I can only deal with what he said and what he did, okay? I try not to get inside and try to assess, unless there's something to indicate, oh, he didn't die a wealthy guy.
He got a cup show to Chicago to make money. He was homeless. That's your hero?
Well, okay. Well, let me address, no, the gentleman is bringing up sincere concerns, and I want to address them. I think this should be a dialogue, right? There is a progression in the guy, and as you brought up a little bit ago, that's, a lot of people interpret that as the reason why the nation was so scared of him, because he began to develop this more cosmopolitan universal view. They saw it as a threat to their black nationalism, right? So, clearly that progression takes place, and then we see it in the film, and we see it through his diaries, where he experiences a different norm when it comes to race relations, particularly after he goes to Mecca, but we see it emerging even before that, right? As to the second part of your question, I don't feel like I'm entitled to tell young African American men or women who their heroes should be, right? So I'm not.
School after him?
I'm not the right. Again, you're asking the wrong guy. Okay.
Any place in the United States they got a school named after Malcolm X that I know of.
Okay. Sure.
It might be. I don't know.
Okay. And what's your point?
The guy was a criminal, a dope pusher, a burglar.
Well, you don't think he was entitled to redemption?
He was entitled, but he was a hustler. And he,
I mean,
he started
you're
to like,
kind of picking on a certain part of his life and
but he started,
discounting all the
he
rest.
started to like white people after Elijah Muhammad threw him out of the Nation of Islam, and then all of a sudden, oh, all you white people, a mosque incorporated, give me the money, and I'll back you. He's a hustler.
Yeah, I know, but you know what? You're just name calling without really any substantiation, because the whole issue is you have to allow an individual the dignity of his beliefs, you know, and so follow that instead of don't just call them names. I mean, like what you know, you have nothing to base it on. I mean, in the film and in his life, he went through a transformation. He struggled with very large issues. Would you deny that there's racism in this country, or that he was facing racism?
Yeah, he's racist. I heard him in the 60s.
Okay, wait a second. Are you denying that there's racism in this
I'm not
country?
denying that.
Well,
Okay, so he is speaking to a genuine social ill. You may not agree with the way he's speaking to it, but you didn't have that experience.
Most black people didn't support him.
Yes, ma'am.
Malcolm X was the greatest hero to black men in this country for many, many years because he stood up and was a man. He wasn't yes sir, no sir, looking at his feet. Let me say that I think that Malcolm X is a hero for all of us because he was a family man. He was devoted to his children. He was devoted to his God. He was devoted to his community. You cannot ask for more than that.
What about Martin Luther King?
He was a good person.
Good person. You don't like him.
I love Martin Luther King. I love Malcolm X.
There's an element of binary simplicity in the way you're seeing things.
Well, you're the intellectual.
I try to
You
be.
want to get real, I'm telling you.
No, and I appreciate that. I mean, you know, you don't see me indignant about your honesty. I appreciate it. I appreciate an honest conversation. I just, like, for example, I mean, when it comes to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, people have these debates. I prefer to think of them as both extraordinary good men, with different flaws, different character, different personalities. But, I mean, you heard it yourself. When you compare the two in terms of, look, you compare Malcolm X being a Muslim to my being a Muslim, he's a monk. I enjoy drink, I enjoy certain things. But, we know certain things about Martin Luther King, we know certain things about Mahatma Gandhi, okay? But these are extraordinary human beings, but they're human beings. So, sir, in the back, yes.
In 1964, Cassius Clay publicly affirmed his relationship with the Nation of Islam and his new name, Muhammad Ali. Do you know if there was any relationship or connection, interaction between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X?
Oh, there was for sure, and they were dear friends. But after Malcolm X was ostracized from the nation, Muhammad Ali maintained his loyalty to the nation for some time thereafter. But then eventually he too outgrew the black nationalism of the nation. And they were not, as far as I know, speaking when Malcolm X was assassinated. And Malcolm X was assassinated right around when he was turning 40. He was about 40 years old. And there is something magical about that age, where you're sort of leaving your younger years and growing into the older years, and you have a different set of priorities, and you see the world differently. Who knows where Malcolm X would have gone had he lived to be 65 or 70, or Martin Luther King, or many of the other heroes.
Do you people talk against 9/11 and all these terrorists?
Who are you people
all these,
exactly?
Organizations, Arab organizations.
I'm not an organization.
Professors,
I'm
kids.
I'm actually these days just a writer. So,
You talk against the 17 Muslims who blew up the 9/11.
Yeah, I see where this is going. Okay. Should I dignify that even with a response? Okay.
Back.
Yes, sir.
I don't know. I guess I just grew up not really listening to very much about like Malcolm X's ideology in school.
Okay.
How much do you think that's attributed to America's perception of Muslim and Islam culture?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, I remember, but again, it depends. I particularly a line from Tupac is coming to my mind. From Tupacalypse Now. How does it go? Why is Martin Luther King in my text each week? Because he told blacks to turn the other cheek. So for Tupac, his particular interpretation, not to say I agree with it, But his particular interpretation was because Martin Luther King was more amenable, maybe to white mainstream sensibilities, he's elevated as a hero, more so than Malcolm X. Whereas Malcolm X was more insistent on fighting back, asserting your rights, not necessarily the turn the other cheek narrative. It's just an interpretation. I'm not saying it's an interpretation that I happen to subscribe to or that it's correct, but there is something in the interpretation. I do think there could be something to be said that Martin Luther King was a Christian preacher too. I mean, it just seems more native, I suppose, right? We do live in a predominantly Christian country, so. Yes, sir.
In the United States now, if you want to build a Christian megachurch, usually not any zoning problems. Every time you want to build a mosque, there seems to be traffic issues, concerns about traffic in the neighborhood. Obviously, it's because there's a latent fear of Islam by a lot of people in this country, and maybe rightly so because of some of the terrorism that occurred for the last 20 years or so.
Well, no, more because of the media narrative.
Well, perhaps, sure.
Rightly so because of the media narrative, but yes,
Well,
sure.
But I guess the question is, what can, and you're not speaking for all of Islam, I understand it, but what, in your own opinion, can Islam do in this country to project a different view of it than maybe the media or extremist acts in the country can give it?
That's a big question, man. That's a big question. Look, this is what's referred to as white privilege. Okay? When statistics, facts will all indicate to you that a Muslim terrorism problem is actually quite negligible statistically. Okay? But no matter how many times I say that, no matter how many times I recite statistics and facts, I still have to answer that. And Milos knows this because he's seen me answer this question before. I still have to answer it again and again and again. That's what we refer to as white privilege. Meanwhile, a white man in Las Vegas can kill, just a horrendous amount of people, but he's a lone wolf.
Right, he's never a terrorist.
He's never a terrorist. He's always suffering from some psychological disability, right? He's always demonstrated to be an anomaly. He's an aberration to whiteness, or to Christianness, or Americanness, or whatever. But the Muslim, regardless of how mentally troubled he may be, is always shown to be the paradigm of the Muslim. That's a media thing. That's not a reality thing. That's not a statistical thing. So, when you ask me that question, I don't have an answer for you. Because it's more of a media thing. Now, one thing I will say, ironically, the presidency of Donald Trump is actually humanizing Muslims more than maybe anything has in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Because Trump is so, and I'm not saying this from a political point of view, I'm just saying there's something about his boorish attitude that provokes so much reaction out of people that if Trump's like, I hate Muslims, I think Muslims are terrorists, the people go running in the other direction. And we're seeing that with a lot of things of social issues today. So Donald Trump is bringing out the best in America and the worst in America at the same time. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you could address the fact that Islam has many faces to it. In Christianity, we have all these different sects, but I think many people, even in this room, probably think there's just one Islam. And why doesn't Islam do this about terrorism when there are all these different sects, there are all these different... And can you speak to how many different sects there are? I know there are so many billions of...
Well, for sure, correct. There's so many interpretations and different ways of practicing. It's so culturally infused. But Islam doesn't do anything.
Right.
Doesn't have two legs and two arms and is walking around somewhere. It's Muslims.
I know that's...
And as long as you have 1.5 billion anything, okay, you're going to have your number of people who lack the intelligence, people who possess the requisite anger, or whatever, to do terrible things. There's certain parts of this country that if I went to them, largely white parts of this country, and I tried to incite violence and try to rally people to act violently, they would, right? Should that be indicative of all white people across America? Of course not. I mean, so it's very simple. You guys are already familiar with it. It's called generalization.
Well, and I would say, the question of that Muslims should represent themselves or should explain themselves. Why is it suddenly upon one religion or people of one religious persuasion to have to explain themselves? Why is it not upon us to try to understand them?
Sure, that's a great point. It's a great point. But again, there is something in the air here. I mean, we watched a film about Malcolm X, who grew up in a time of undeniable oppression, segregation, civil rights violations, and we're still kind of trying Malcolm X,
Right.
which, that kind of says something, that we're unable to, I mean, not all of us, but some of us are unable to extend the kind of sympathy and empathy towards that. Yes, sir.
Doesn't the Quran say that Christians and Jews be subservient to Islam on pain of death?
No, actually it does not.
I got I could give you the 9 and 11, something like that.
The 9/11 again.
I mean, not 9/11, 9/15, 9/20, something like
Yeah,
that.
no, it does not say that. It does not say that. Okay.
It does.
Okay, you got it. If that's the Islam that you practice, sir, then you're free to.
I read the book.
Okay, well, you're free to have that interpretation. You're free to go along with it. I'm not going to.
Interpretation.
Okay, I'm not going to.
Okay.
So, and you do recognize that I'm free to not go along with that, right?
Sure.
Okay. Do you think that you know the religion better than me?
I know very little. I just studied for this meeting here.
Well, that sounds about right.
See,
That sounds about right.
but I know about terrorists. I know about 9/11. I know about that we have to.
Okay, as a,
poll tax. We gotta pay poll, and if we don't do it, we.
No, now you're talking about taxes in a 7th century context
Correct.
and projecting it onto a 21st century context, which is requires a more sophisticated conversation than just kind of prepping for 15 minutes of a Q&A. No, you're correct. There is a 7th century, and let me explain it to you, okay? Because I don't want you to feel shortchanged. There is a tax called the jizya tax, all right? If you're not Muslim, you pay a jizya tax. Christians and Jews pay a jizya tax. Now, would being Christian and Jewish within an Islamic polity in the 8th and 9th century would be something more analogous to holding a green card as opposed to citizenship in 21st century America. Okay? So there were different taxes. See, Jews and Christians didn't pay certain taxes that the Muslims had to pay. So in order to tax everybody, different tax brackets had to be created. What happens is people in the 20th and 21st century go back to the 7th and 8th century. They say, look, they pay different taxes and so on and so forth. Well, guess what? People in America also pay different taxes. There's different statuses for people with green cards, for people who have citizenship. So it's more of a complex issue, and one you can't just readily carry forth into the 21st century and say, see, this is indicative of oppression or something like that. If I have to go into a lecture about the fact that Islam of the Abrahamic faiths is actually the most pluralistic, I can. I hope I don't have to, because it's not why we're here. But Islam is the only religion of the 3 that recognizes the other 2 as valid religions. You can't say that about Judaism or Christianity either. However, one more thing, I would not perennially condemn Judaism and Christianity as being somehow oppressive. All of these religious traditions possess institutions and people who populate those institutions and accommodate changing circumstances. Sometimes the traditions are more tolerant, sometimes they're less tolerant, depends on where you are and when you are at any given time. I'd say the same thing about the United States. Right now we're under a leadership that is less tolerant. I do not like projecting an essence onto the United States where I say that's America, that's it. It's the only thing America is capable of being. It ebb and flows. It changes with circumstances and times. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for putting this event together. I really like the idea.
Oh, thank Milosh. That's all Milosh.
I like the idea of looking at a contemporary problem or issue through the lens of film. So I wonder if Milos, you would talk about what you think are the differences between looking at a contemporary issue through a biopic like this as opposed to a documentary.
That's a great question.
What are the strengths of those different approaches? Like how would you look at this through the spectrum of other historical biopics? You know, just riff on that for a while if you would.
Well, you know, we try to stay away, I mean, in this whole series, and that's kind of the challenge in programming, is to stay away pretty much from films that are very specific. And this is possibly the most specific film that we've shown in this whole series. And that's meant that we haven't shown very many documentaries because then you are too much wedded to this one very specific singular issue. And so the challenge in programming this is always to find some film which at least extrapolates the issues in a larger context. So you're looking at a larger issue. You're not looking at, well, maybe Murder of Fred Hampton, which we showed in the series, was very specific, which was this whole thing on police violence. But to get back to your point, the difference between documentary and fiction is the fiction film in some ways is always broader, and more abstracted in some ways, so it allows you to really enter and take it apart more to get at the issue that's underneath it. And that's what I think is interesting, and the discussions that we've had here, including tonight, have always been very productive and deeper, I think because of it, because if the film frames some of those issues correctly, then we all challenge to think them through. I don't know what else I can add to that. I mean, does that kind of answer it?
Anyone else?
No?
Well, that's you say the Christians and Jews throw in the Hindus and the Buddhists that the Islam does not accept. Isn't that true?
Again, no. I mean, look at the Mughal Empire.
That's what the book
Look, yeah, well, okay. Yeah, it's just, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. See you.
All right. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you very much, Laith.